Anthony, I, like everyone else, would love to know whether God exists, and I like arguments. So I listened to a welter of arguments, the classical arguments from medieval scholasticism to modern arguments for God in terms of the universe, and then the arguments of atheists, the problem of evil. As a philosopher, when you see all these arguments coming together, religious experience, miracles, morality, how do you classify them? How do you begin to approach all of these arguments?
Well, the familiar arguments, like the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the argument from design, and so on, are, as everybody who's done a 101 course in philosophy knows, are notably weak. I mean, they are pretty easy to attack from a number of points of view, and we can discuss that. From an historical point of view, there is something very interesting to be said about arguments for the existence of God, and that is that they too are a notably recent emanation. The first most famous of them, of course, the ontological argument, is an argument put by Anselm in the medieval period. And it's interesting that it should have arisen just then when literacy was reviving. Mm-hmm. Back in ancient times, in those parts of the world where religion had a real grip on people, it was very easy to prove that there is God. You only had to point to the thunder or the lightning or the earthquake or something, and then you could spin a story which said, this is a God or God doing something because you've sinned and the rest. And people would take that. Credulity is an evolutionary important feature of our psyches. But as literacy revived in the medieval period, the appeal to something else, namely, there is a God because it's written in the book that there is a God. The great authority of the Bible, the great authority of authorities, was just beginning to loosen. So something more was needed. And a logical argument, the ontological argument is a logical argument, seemed to be the way to go, to appeal to an increasingly educated minority of people. And then the cosmological argument, the argument from design, are very characteristic arguments to come up at the time, the 17th, 18th, 19th century, when science was arising. So people began to turn, much as in the 1950s and 60s, people thought God might be an astronaut because the first space flight was happening. So with the rise of science, slightly more scientific type of arguments, with a bit more of a scientific feel, came into vogue. So there's an historical trajectory to be looked at here about the kinds of things that are appealed to by apologists to try and be persuasive.
Many theists would certainly reject the concept that you could take these arguments all the way to God, but a good many would say that you can't really exclude them as adding to the so-called cumulative case, that each of these arguments adds a little bit. And then when you add morality and the religious experience for those who've had it, miracles, if you believe it, each one adds a little bit, so that ultimately when you have all of these arguments together, you have the likelihood of God being more highly probable than not. And then if you have a little bit of this personal experience, you can go all the way. That's the way it works.
It's so interesting, isn't it, that if that were the argument, that there is a kind of cumulative overall effect, an increasing weight of support for the thesis, that what the history of the last 3 or 4 centuries has shown us, at least in the Western world, is exactly the opposite, that the weight of evidence cumulatively has been increasingly against the idea that there are religious truths or entities of any kind. And this is because the argument from evil, the inconsistency of there being a divine, omnipotent, and benevolent creator, given childhood cancers and tsunamis that kill hundreds of thousands of people and so on, that argument has become more and more persuasive. In fact, the turning point really was in the 18th century with the great earthquake and tsunami that killed many tens of thousands in Lisbon in, I think it was 1755. Voltaire wrote about it and captured a mood where people thought this is just inconsistent with the idea of providence, the idea of providence being a benign government of the world. How could an agent, even with the most ordinary attitudes that a father has to his children in any town of Germany or France, allow such a thing to happen? Add that's the moral case, to the accumulating evidence in science, to the greater explanation of natural phenomena, and to the loosening of the grip on individuals in their experience of faith, unless they've been brought up very strictly in a tradition of faith. And there you have the cumulative weight going against religion and not for it.
So basically you can build up a parallel case cumulatively against the existence of God as is done on the other side for the existence of God. Let's just take one example, the cosmological argument, which basically says if you have anything happening, it has to have a cause, and you go back, and either you have an infinite regress, you have a cause of a cause of a cause, or you have a stopping point. How do you deal with that?
Well, of course, there are lots of different ways of approaching it. One recognizes that there is a logical fallacy in the argument. It's known as the fallacy of composition. You know, the fact that every individual member of the species whales is a whale doesn't follow that the species is a whale. So the fact that everything in the universe has a cause doesn't mean that the universe has a cause. You know, everything is a caused entity or event in the universe. Doesn't mean the universe has a cause.
Is that a persuasive counterattack on that argument?
Well, if you go the further step, which is necessary, which is to say that the cause of the universe, if there is such a thing, won't be on the same ontological and explanatory level as the cause of individual events within the universe. So there may be some story to be told about the Big Bang, which is very different, of course, from the story to be told about how a flower and why a flower grows from a seed. That's just one example of how you might approach that. I think probably the strongest way to approach it, however, is to point to the fact that wanting there to be a first term, finding it intolerable that there should be a sequence that doesn't have a first term, is a very characteristic fact about our pattern-seeking and narrative-seeking minds, which are always long for closure, always long for a certain kind of neatness, feel very unhappy with ragged edges. And it may very well be that the idea that it's very hard to imagine what kind of first term there was, if there was one, or even if there was one, is something that has to be left open.
Theologians, sometimes to my surprise, will say that they're not uncomfortable with an infinite regress and claim that the question of God is not just a temporal explanation, what came before, and willing to admit the whole sequence could be infinite, but ontologically explanatory. Does that argument have any philosophical validity?
Well, the idea that God is eternal, so outside time, so the conditions of space and time which are required for the idea of a sequence and of originating terms falls away because there just is what there is, and it's well, then it's wrong to say that it's forever, but that's what we're groping for. Is a neat way out of the problem about first terms, but in itself just forces a lot of questions which we, again, get no grip on. It feels like an ad hoc move. It's like saying, well, we've got this problem about potential infinite regress, going back and back and back through time. So let's just dispense with the notion of time and say there isn't any, that the truth about the universe is that it is just all eternally present. And that does sound like an ad hoc maneuver.